Rain whispered against the windows of Ashkam House as though the heavens themselves pitied her. The scent of damp stone and fading roses filled the long corridor where Lady Eleanor stood, hands clasped before her, her reflection pale in the gilt mirror. 19 years of carefully bred grace had taught her how to stand still, how to appear composed even when her world was breaking quietly beneath her slippers. From the drawing room came the low hum of voices, her father's, clipped and desperate, and another, deep and unhurried. The voice of a man old enough to have known her grandfather. She had been told to wait until called, but curiosity, or perhaps dread, urged her closer. Through the crack of the half-closed door, she saw her father seated stiffly by the fire, a decanter of brandy untouched beside him. Across from him sat the Duke of Hawthorne, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with a face lined not in cruelty but in solitude. The world called him severe. To Eleanor, in that first secret glimpse, he looked simply tired. "You understand the necessity, Your Grace," her father was saying, his voice a whisper sharpened by humiliation. "The creditors are relentless. The scandal has ruined any prospect of advantage. My daughter's hand is all I have left to barter." The Duke's reply came after a pause long enough for the clock to mark its sorrow. "Barter is an unkind word, Lord Ashkam. I do not deal in flesh or fortune. But I will marry the lady, if she consents." Her father exhaled, the sound more plea than breath. "She will do her duty." The words fell like stones. Eleanor stepped back into the corridor, her heartbeat a drum beneath the weight of her gown. Duty. It was the word every woman of her world learned before love, before self. She pressed her palms to the cold wall and felt tears threaten, but she would not let them fall, not where servants might see, not where gossip could grow teeth. At dinner that evening, the house glittered with false peace. Her father spoke of politics as though ruin were not seated at the table with them. Her mother avoided her gaze entirely. Eleanor barely tasted the food, aware only of the way conversation faltered when the Duke's name was mentioned. The servants moved like ghosts. Outside the rain thickened. Later, her aunt, sharp-eyed, silk rustling, entered her chamber uninvited. "My dear," she said, adjusting the dying embers in the hearth, "you must remember this. A woman's misfortune is bearable only if she bears it beautifully. You are to be a duchess. Hold your chin high when they whisper." Eleanor turned from the mirror where her reflection trembled. "And if I cannot?" Her aunt smiled thinly. "Then you will learn." The following morning, a carriage approached the gate. Its wheels hissed on the wet gravel, and the sound drew the household to the windows. The Duke of Hawthorne had come earlier than expected. Eleanor stood at the top of the staircase as he entered the hall, tall though stooped slightly, his black coat glistening with rain. He removed his hat and bowed not to her father but to her. "My lady," he said quietly. His voice was unexpectedly kind, a deep timbre that seemed to soften the space around it. "Forgive the intrusion. I wish to see that the arrangements cause you no distress." Her father coughed, startled. "A most considerate gesture, Your Grace." But the Duke's eyes remained on Eleanor. They were pale like winter morning light, yet she felt no chill in them. Only gentleness and something else, remorse perhaps for the world that had driven them both to this. Eleanor descended the stairs slowly. "You honor us with your visit, my lord." "I did not come for honor," he replied. "Only for truth. I have heard what they say, that this marriage is a punishment. I would rather you despised me for my age than pitied me for my kindness. I have no wish to be the villain in your youth." The candlesticks flickered. Her father shifted uncomfortably, muttering about propriety, but she barely heard him. There was sincerity in the Duke's tone, a quiet dignity that unsettled her composure. "Then what do you wish to be, Your Grace?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, as though considering whether honesty would be unseemly. "A protector, if you will permit it. Nothing more until you ask it of me." Her throat tightened. No suitor had ever spoken so plainly, with such unadorned respect. "You would give me the freedom to refuse you?" "Freedom," he said, "is the first gift I offer my bride." Her father interjected sharply, "Eleanor, you will thank his grace." She curtsied. "Thank you, my lord." He inclined his head, accepting her words as though they carried genuine warmth. When he turned to leave, she noticed a faint limp in his step, a relic of some forgotten campaign. Outside, his carriage lanterns glowed dim through the drizzle. She watched them vanish beyond the gates and felt, inexplicably, a hollow ache of concern. That night, London's whispers reached even their shuttered street. A letter arrived from her cousin, filled with gleeful cruelty. "The old Duke? My dear Eleanor, you are to marry winter itself." She folded it neatly, placed it in the fire, and watched it curl into ash. In her solitude, she thought of his voice, the careful way he had spoken, as if words themselves were fragile. She thought of her father's trembling hands, her mother's silence, the servants' pitying glances. And she wondered whether gentleness could truly survive in a world that valued appearance over sincerity. 2 days later, her maid brought news. The Duke had sent a carriage for her to visit Hawthorne Manor before the ceremony. Her father insisted she go, it would ease the transition. The journey wound through mist-coated hills, the countryside hushed beneath early spring rain. Through the fog, the manor emerged, vast yet solemn, its windows aglow like steadfast eyes watching the years pass. At the entrance, the Duke awaited her, a greyhound at his side, the same measured composure upon his face. "Welcome home, Lady Eleanor," he said softly and offered his arm. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. His sleeve was warm beneath her fingers, his steadiness oddly reassuring. Inside, every room bore traces of a life once shared with another. The late Duchess's portrait, the careful order of books and flowers, but nothing ostentatious. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. When he showed her the music room, she paused before the pianoforte. "Did she play?" "She did," he answered. "Badly, but with enthusiasm." A small smile escaped her despite herself. For the first time in weeks, she breathed without pain. As dusk deepened, he accompanied her to the carriage once more. "I shall not see you again until the vows are spoken," he said. "But I would not have you enter that church fearing me." Eleanor looked at him, at the lines age had drawn across his features, at the quiet dignity of a man who seemed to stand outside the world's cruelty. "You are not what they said," she whispered. "And you," he replied, "are far more than they deserve." The rain began again, soft as a benediction. She climbed into the carriage, her heart uncertain, her mind alive with questions she had never been brave enough to ask. As the wheels turned toward London, she pressed her fingers to the windowpane and saw him still standing in the rain, bareheaded, watching until she vanished into the fog. And for the first time, she feared that pity was giving way to something far more dangerous. The day before her wedding dawned with a clarity that felt almost cruel. London awoke glistening under a thin veil of frost, every rooftop etched in light, every church bell mocking her with its gaiety. Lady Eleanor sat by the window of her chamber, her sewing untouched, her gaze lost in the bustle of the street below, carriages thundering past, flower sellers crying their wares, a boy running with a paper that likely bore her name among its columns. She knew what they said in the drawing rooms of Mayfair. That she was the Ashkam girl sold to a man old enough to be her grandfather. That the Duke of Hawthorne must have taken pity, or worse, desire disguised as mercy. The truth was quieter, sadder, and infinitely more complex than gossip could ever make it. When the footman entered bearing a velvet box, Eleanor thought it must contain yet another reminder of obligation, a necklace too heavy to wear or a token meant to silence doubt. But when she opened it, her breath caught. Inside lay a small gold locket, unadorned but exquisitely wrought, with a pressed violet sealed beneath the glass. She turned it in her palm. It was light, delicate, and impossibly intimate. A folded note rested beneath. For courage, not compliance. The simplicity of the gesture undid her. For a moment she saw not the Duke, the stranger she was to marry, but a man who had known loneliness deeply enough to recognize it in another. Yet before warmth could take root, the sound of laughter echoed from the corridor, sharp, feminine, merciless. Her cousin Marianne swept in, a vision of silk and satisfaction. "My dearest Eleanor," she began, her tone dripping with false affection, "I have come to wish you joy on your great occasion. The tongue will speak of nothing else for weeks. To think, a duchess before 20. You'll be quite the cautionary tale at balls." Eleanor closed the locket quietly. "Good morning, Marianne." Marianne leaned close, lowering her voice. "Do you suppose he can still dance? Or does he creak like the furniture at Hawthorne Manor?" "Enough," Eleanor said softly. But Marianne only smiled wider, seeing the tremor in her cousin's hand. "Oh, do not scowl so, darling. You should be grateful. Not every girl ruined by her father's debts finds a savior. He must have a fondness for tragic beauty, or perhaps merely obedience." Eleanor stood, every inch of breeding holding her still. "You may leave." When the door finally closed, the laughter echoed long after. She pressed the locket to her chest as though to muffle it. Outside, a carriage wheel splashed through the street, sending a wave of muddy water against the glass. It struck her that this city would not remember her kindness, her pain, or her dignity, only her spectacle. That evening, The household gathered for a final dinner before her departure. Candles trembled in their sconces, throwing uneasy shadows across polished silver. Her father avoided her gaze entirely. Her mother dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief and murmured platitudes about fortune restored. Every word felt like an epitaph. Halfway through the meal, a servant entered bearing an envelope. "From Hawthorne Manor, my lord," he said, handing it to her father. Her father broke the seal, frowned, and passed it silently to her. The Duke's handwriting was careful, measured. "Permit me the small liberty of sending my regard before the morrow. I hope the world is kind to you tonight. It has seldom been kind to me." Something within her shifted, small, imperceptible but real. The dinner continued in brittle silence, but she heard nothing save that single line echoing in her mind. "It has seldom been kind to me." Later, when she retreated upstairs, she found her maid packing gowns for the journey. The maid hesitated before speaking. "Beg pardon, my lady, but there's been talk below stairs. They say His Grace sent you a locket." "Yes," Eleanor said cautiously. "They're saying it's improper," the maid whispered. "That it's romantic. That it's proof the Duke means to, well, treat you as more than a wife in name." Eleanor turned away, embarrassed by her own racing pulse. "You may finish packing," she said quietly. But long after the maid had gone, she sat before her mirror, turning the violet locket in her hands. Improper or not, it was the first thing given to her without condition. By morning, London had chosen its story. Everywhere she looked, eyes followed her with poorly disguised amusement. When her carriage halted outside the modistes, she overheard two ladies whisper, "That's her, the child bride of the mourning Duke. Pity really. She'll be a widow before she learns how to smile." She entered the shop anyway, spine straight, voice calm. Yet each fitting pin felt like another reminder that her life no longer belonged to her. When the seamstress suggested altering the neckline to something less youthful, Eleanor almost laughed. At dusk, when she returned home, a messenger awaited her with a sealed letter marked with the Hawthorne crest. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Lady Eleanor, forgive my intrusion upon your final hours of freedom. I ask only this, that you bring no fear to our vows. I'm not a man of demands. Whatever they have told you, I seek no possession, only peace. Should you find joy within our walls, it will not be because I required it, but because you chose to stay. Yours H." The words blurred as her eyes filled. He wrote the word as though it were something one might offer in a bouquet. She pressed the letter to her lips, not out of love but gratitude. It had been years since anyone had offered her gentleness without asking for obedience in return. That night, unable to sleep, she crept to the window and gazed across the city. The sky burned low over the rooftops, 1,000 chimneys breathing warmth into the cold. Somewhere beyond those lights, the Duke was perhaps awake as well, reading by lamplight, his solitude stretching toward hers like an invisible bridge. When morning came, the world seemed newly washed. Her father's carriage stood waiting, draped in the Ashkam crest that would soon be replaced by another. As the horses stamped in the mist, Eleanor descended the steps slowly, each movement deliberate, graceful, final. Her father offered his arm but said nothing. The weight of his shame hung heavier than her veil. They reached the church before noon. Its spire rose against a pale sky, bells tolling as if to remind her of the inevitability of vows. Inside, guests turned their heads, whispers rippling like silk. She met no one's gaze. The Duke awaited her at the altar. His attire was plain black, his expression unreadable save for the faintest tremor of relief when he saw her. He bowed low as she approached, and in that gesture, something sacred flickered through the mockery of spectacle. As the vows were spoken, her voice trembled only once, at the line "for better or for worse." His did not waver at all. When he slipped the ring upon her finger, his hands were steady, his touch reverent. The ceremony concluded beneath the weight of applause that felt almost cruel. Yet when they stepped outside, the sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a halo of light across the Duke's silver hair. He turned to her quietly, almost shyly. "Are you cold, my lady?" "A little," she admitted. "Then," he said, offering his arm, "let us go home." As they walked toward the carriage, Eleanor glanced back once at the crowd, faces filled with pity, envy, and derision. But amid that sea of judgment, she felt the faintest stir of defiance, like the first bud of spring pushing through frost. And though she could not name it yet, something in her heart whispered that perhaps this was not the end of her freedom, but the beginning of its truest form. The carriage rattled through the long, winding drive toward Hawthorne Manor, its wheels murmuring over gravel like distant thunder. Rain streaked the windows, softening the world into watercolor shades of gray and green. Inside, Eleanor sat rigidly opposite her new husband, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. The Duke of Hawthorne sat with equal stillness, his expression unreadable save for the occasional flicker of his gaze toward her, brief, cautious, as though he feared that looking too long might wound her. Between them hung the silence of strangers who share a name. When the carriage halted before the great entrance, she expected grandeur, some ostentatious display of status meant to remind her of the price of her family's salvation. But the house that loomed before her was solemn rather than proud, a stately country manor weathered by time, ivy climbing its stone walls, its windows glowing softly against the gloom. Servants lined the steps, heads bowed. The air smelled of rain, oak, and faint lavender. The Duke extended his hand. "Welcome home, Your Grace." She hesitated only a moment before placing her fingers in his. His palm was warm, his grip steady, neither possessive nor hesitant. Inside, firelight gilded the dark oak panels, and the hush of the entrance hall swallowed the sound of her heart. Paintings watched her from the walls, ancestral faces, solemn and judgmental. At the top of the staircase hung a single portrait larger than the rest, a woman with dark eyes and a faint, knowing smile. "She was my wife," the Duke said quietly when he saw her looking. "Elizabeth." Eleanor inclined her head. "She must have been lovely." "She was kind," he said simply. Then after a pause, "I have moved her things to the East Gallery. I thought it best you not feel haunted." The gesture, so considerate and unexpected, unsettled her. She had prepared herself for cold civility, not this gentle precision. "You did not have to," she murmured. "I know," he said, his eyes resting on hers for one breath longer than custom allowed. "But I wish to." Days passed with the strange, polite rhythm of coexistence. They dined together, but conversation was brief. Weather, estate affairs, her comfort. At night, she heard the echo of his footsteps pacing the study until the small hours. In the mornings, she found books waiting for her in the breakfast room. Austen, Milton, the occasional volume of poetry with passages marked by his careful hand. She did not know whether the selections were meant to reveal him or distract her from her loneliness. One afternoon, unable to bear the weight of curiosity, Eleanor wandered through the manor and found herself before a pair of tall doors carved with vines. She pushed them open and gasped softly. The library. A cathedral of books stretching from floor to ceiling, ladders poised like guardians against the shelves. Dust motes danced in the slanted light. The scent, paper, wood, ink, felt oddly comforting. "You found my sanctuary," said a voice behind her. She turned to find him in the doorway, hands clasped behind his back, the faintest smile touching his lips. "Forgive me," she said. "I did not mean to intrude." "It is yours now as much as mine," he replied. "I hoped you would discover it." She traced her gloved fingers along the spines of the books nearest her. "You have more volumes than the Bodleian." "Half are unread," he said. "A man collects what he cannot conquer." She smiled despite herself. "And what is it you cannot conquer, Your Grace?" He met her gaze evenly. "Loneliness." The word lingered in the air like a confession. She turned back to the shelves, her throat tight. "You speak as though it were a battle." "For some," he said, "it is." A storm broke outside, lightning flashing through the tall windows. The wind moaned against the glass. They stood in the hush that followed, two shadows bound by propriety yet caught in something fragile and human. He crossed to a small writing desk, his limp barely perceptible until then. She noticed how he leaned slightly on one arm as he poured wine into two slender glasses. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to one. She nodded. He handed her the glass, their fingers brushing briefly, just enough for her pulse to trip. They drank in silence. Then he said, "They think me unfeeling, you know. Society. They mistake restraint for absence." "And what is it truly?" she asked. "Survival." Eleanor set her glass down carefully. "We have that in common then." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that both had been shaped by cruelty dressed as decorum. He took a slow breath. "I did not want to marry again. I swore I would not. But when your father came to me, when I saw your name upon his letter, He broke off, shaking his head as if the memory itself pained him. "You looked so lost at that dinner the night I first called. I thought perhaps I could give you peace if not happiness." Her voice trembled. "Why me? There must have been others more suitable." "Perhaps," he said softly. "But none who looked at me as though I were not a sentence to be endured." The words struck her like music too tender to bear. She turned toward the window, watching rain lash the glass, unsure whether to weep or smile. "I did not mean to pity you." "I know," he said. "That is what made it kind." Thunder cracked above the roof, startling her. He moved closer, not touching her, only near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his presence. The library seemed to shrink around them, its silence deepening into something intimate. "Eleanor," he said her name softly as though testing it. "You need not fear me." She faced him then, heart trembling. "It is not fear," she said. "It is the not knowing what is expected of me." He hesitated, then answered with a gentleness that undid her composure entirely. "Expect nothing. You are not here to pay a debt nor to play a role. If ever you find reason to care for me, let it be your own choosing." Outside, lightning tore the sky in two, illuminating his face, those solemn eyes, lined with years but tender in their sincerity. She could not speak. Instead, she nodded once, her breath catching as the storm thundered again. He smiled faintly. "Then I shall count that as the first truth between us." Before she could reply, the door burst open. A young footman stood there, dripping from the rain. "Forgive me, your grace, there is trouble at the stables. One of the mares has broken loose." The Duke's expression shifted instantly to concern. "Send for the handler." "I'll come myself." Eleanor stepped forward. "You should not go, it's storming." He looked at her, a flicker of gratitude passing through his eyes. "It's only rain, my lady." But when he turned away, she noticed how he steadied himself on the doorframe before leaving. The storm raged on long after his footsteps faded down the hall. Alone in the great library, Eleanor listened to the wind batter the windows, her heart a strange tangle of worry and awakening. She reached for the glass he had left behind. His warmth lingered on its rim. A sharp crack echoed from outside, wood splintering, hooves screaming, and she froze. Servants' voices rose in alarm. Somewhere in that chaos she heard his name shouted into the night. And in that instant she knew with a clarity that startled her. She could no longer bear the thought of losing him. The storm had not relented by morning. The sky hung low and sullen over the estate, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth and smoke from the hearths. Eleanor stood at the window of her chamber, her fingers resting on the cold glass. Below, the courtyard was a chaos of movement. Stable boys leading limping horses, servants carrying buckets, voices sharp in the mist. Somewhere in that blur of activity she glimpsed him, his dark coat soaked through, his silver hair plastered to his temples. The Duke was giving instructions calmly, though she could see the faint stiffness in his movements, the favoring of his left leg. By the time she reached the stables, her slippers were ruined, her skirts heavy with mud. The men stopped when they saw her, bowing awkwardly, surprised by her presence. The Duke turned at the sound of her voice. "You should not be here," he said, his tone more concerned than stern. "You're hurt," she replied. She saw the smear of blood on his sleeve, the torn fabric near his shoulder. "It's nothing," he said lightly. "A stubborn mare. I was more foolish than brave." Without waiting for permission, she reached for his arm. "Please," she said softly. "Let me see." He hesitated, then allowed her to guide him inside the empty tack room. The air smelled of leather and rain. She tore a strip from her handkerchief and dabbed at the wound. His breath caught, not from pain she thought but from surprise at her tenderness. "You should rest," she murmured. He smiled faintly. "And miss my wife commanding the stables like a general?" She met his gaze and for once could not look away. "If I command anything, it is only out of fear." "Fear?" he asked gently. "Of losing you," she whispered. The words slipped out before she could stop them. He froze, eyes widening as though uncertain he had heard correctly. The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the rain tapping against the roof like a heartbeat. Then, slowly, he lifted her hand and pressed it to his lips. "Eleanor," he said, her name a reverent whisper. "You will not lose me so easily." But that evening, a letter arrived that threatened to unravel everything. It came sealed in red wax, delivered by a trembling servant. When the Duke read it, his expression changed. First confusion, then quiet sorrow. Eleanor, sensing something, asked, "What is it?" He folded the paper carefully, his composure too perfect. "A matter for me to settle privately." Her heart sank. "Is it about my father?" He did not answer. Later, when he retired to his study, she could no longer bear the silence. She crept down the dim corridor, guided by the faint glow of lamplight beneath the door. Through the narrow crack, she saw him seated at his desk, the letter open before him. His face, so often unreadable, was now a landscape of pain. She heard his low voice, "Foolish man, and she does not know." The words chilled her. She pushed the door open. Does not know what? He rose instantly. Eleanor, this is not. She crossed the room and snatched the letter before he could stop her. Her eyes moved swiftly over the page and she felt the world tilt beneath her feet. It was her father's handwriting, florid and desperate. I trust you remember our arrangement. My daughter's dowry was not a gift but a bargain. Send the remainder of the funds before the season begins, or I will tell her what you truly purchased. Her voice shook. Purchased? What is he talking about? The Duke's expression broke. He lies. Or rather, he tells a truth so twisted it resembles deceit. Then tell me the truth. He closed his eyes. When your father came to me he begged for your security. He said creditors threatened to have him imprisoned. I agreed to settle his debts, but only if he promised your consent. I meant to rescue you, not buy you. Her throat ached. You could have told me. I feared you would think me no better than the rest. Tears blurred her vision. And now the world will think you bought me. He stepped forward, his voice raw. Let them. I care nothing for their judgment. But I cannot bear yours. She wanted to believe him, wanted it with all her heart, but the shame of her father's betrayal clung to her like soot. You should have trusted me, she whispered. You at least. He reached for her hand but she drew back. The hurt in his eyes was unbearable. Eleanor, please. I need time, she said. She fled before her courage could fail. The next days passed in silence. She took her meals alone, wandering the halls like a ghost, the house echoing with what they could not say. The Duke continued his routines, letters, estate matters, the occasional walk in the garden, but his absence pressed on her like a physical weight. She caught glimpses of him from windows, standing beneath the trees, his coat unbuttoned, face tilted to the wind as though seeking absolution from the sky itself. One afternoon she found the servants whispering near the hearth. They say his grace is unwell, one murmured. He's been coughing blood since the storm. Eleanor's heart clenched. Without hesitation she went to his study. He was there as always, though paler now, a sheen of sweat on his brow. A fire burned low behind him. He looked up when she entered. You should not trouble yourself, he said softly. Then who should? She crossed the room, her composure fracturing. Why did you not tell me you were ill? He smiled faintly. You had other wounds to tend. She knelt beside him, taking his cold hand in hers. I was angry, yes, but not ungrateful. You did not deserve my silence. His fingers tightened weakly around hers. Eleanor, if I have any strength left, it is because you entered this house. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Then promise me you will fight to stay in it. He brushed her tears with trembling fingers. I am not leaving you willingly. When the physician arrived that evening, the verdict was grim, a fever born of exhaustion and exposure. The Duke must remain abed, the doctor warned, or risk decline. Eleanor refused to leave his side. She read to him, changed the linens, coaxed him to eat, and whispered prayers when the fever raged. Through sleepless nights, she learned every line of his face, every gentle turn of his voice. The man she had married from duty had become the man whose breath she counted. On the third night, he stirred from delirium and caught her wrist weakly. Forgive me, he murmured, for loving you more than I meant to. Her heart shattered. Then forgive me for finally learning how to love you. He smiled barely. Ah, then we are even. Outside, dawn broke, a thin gold light filtering through the rain-soaked glass. Eleanor looked at him, pale but breathing, and felt something unspoken settle between them. Not apology, not promise, but something more sacred. Yet even as relief washed through her, she knew the world beyond these walls would not stay quiet for long. London had teeth and scandal had already caught their scent. And somewhere in the city her father, drunk on desperation, was about to write another letter. The letter arrived at dawn, carried by a courier whose face was pale with the weight of gossip. Eleanor received it herself, her hands trembling as she broke the seal. The handwriting was unmistakable, her father's, but jagged now, the script of a man unraveling. They threatened to seize the estate. The Duke will not survive another scandal. Spare him by leaving. Spare yourself by silence. The words struck her like blows. She read them twice, then folded the letter carefully, as though gentleness might alter its cruelty. Outside, Hawthorne Manor was drenched in the rose gold of early morning. The gardens shimmered from last night's rain, and the world seemed almost peaceful, too peaceful for what her heart carried. Upstairs, the Duke slept at last, his fever waning, the lines of pain softened by rest. She stood at the threshold of his chamber, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, feeling that peculiar ache of love mixed with fear. How strange, she thought, that a union meant to punish her had become the only sanctuary she had ever known. When he stirred, she moved to his side. His voice, still faint but warm, found her. "You've not slept again." "I could not," she admitted. He smiled weakly. "Then we are alike. My dreams insist upon keeping me company." She sat beside him, the letter burning against her palm. "Do they bring you peace?" "They bring me you," he murmured. "That is enough." Tears pricked her eyes, but she hid them behind composure. "You should not flatter me before breakfast, Your Grace." He chuckled softly. "It's my only remedy for illness." The intimacy of their banter would have seemed unthinkable weeks ago. Now it was all she had. Yet beneath their quiet joy, dread grew, a truth waiting like a shadow at the edge of the light. She reached for his hand. "If the world turns against us, would you still let me stay?" He opened his eyes fully then, their gray depths searching hers. "I would chain the world itself to keep you near." The words undid her. She wanted to confess everything, to tell him of the letter, her father's schemes, her fear that the scandal would destroy them both. But before she could speak, a knock echoed through the room. The butler entered, stiff and apologetic. "Your Grace," he said, bowing to them both. "A visitor has arrived from London. Lord Ashkam insists upon seeing his daughter." The Duke's expression hardened instantly, though his voice remained calm. "Show him to the drawing room." Eleanor rose. "Please, let me speak to him first." "No," the Duke said firmly, already pushing himself upright despite his frailty. "You shall not face him alone." "Henry," she whispered, using his name for the first time. It startled them both. "You are too weak." He smiled faintly. "For most things, yes. But not for you." By the time they reached the drawing room, her father was already pacing before the hearth, his face gaunt and flushed with desperation. The moment he saw her, he began to speak. No greeting, no shame. "Eleanor, my dear, you must convince him. I've debts that will ruin us all. Tell your husband to release the rest of the funds." The Duke stood silent by the doorway, every inch of his bearing dignified. Eleanor's voice was steady but cold. "I told you never to come here." Her father sneered. "And yet here I am because you've forgotten your duty. He is rich and I am dying of disgrace." "You have disgraced only yourself," she said. The Duke stepped forward then, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, a gesture of quiet strength. "Lord Ashkam, your threats end today. I have paid every debt, shielded every rumor, and suffered your insults in silence for her sake. You will not poison her peace any longer." Ashkam's gaze darted between them, bitter with envy. "Do you truly believe she loves you? Look at her, Hawthorne. Look at the youth you've chained yourself to. She will outlive your fortune, your name, your years. You think she's a blessing, but she's your penance." The words struck the air like daggers. Eleanor's breath caught, but before she could speak, the Duke answered, his voice cutting through the silence. "If she is my penance, then may I be blessed to endure it all my days." Ashkam scoffed, stepping closer, his face twisted with anger. "You pity her. That's not love." "No," the Duke said quietly, his eyes on Eleanor. "Pity is what the world offered her. Love is what she taught me to return." Something in her father broke then, perhaps pride, perhaps the last fragile thread of decency. He turned to her, voice hoarse. "You've chosen ruin over loyalty." "I have chosen truth," she said. He reached into his coat, drawing out a folded document. "Then truth you shall have." He threw it at the Duke's feet. "A record of every debt paid, every coin exchanged. Let the world see what kind of virtue bought your comfort." Eleanor bent to pick it up, but the Duke stopped her. "No." His voice was low, trembling not with anger but sorrow. "He cannot wound us with what we have already survived." Ashkam's shoulders slumped, the fight leaving him. "Then I am finished." He stumbled toward the door. "You'll hear from me no more." When the door closed behind him, the room fell into stillness. Eleanor turned to her husband, expecting relief. Instead, she saw him sway slightly, his complexion ashen. "Henry," she gasped, catching him as he faltered. He shook his head faintly. "It's nothing, only the strain." But by the time they reached the chair, his strength was gone. She called for the servants, for the physician, but even before they came, she knew, the fever had returned, fiercer than before. The night that followed blurred into agony. She refused to leave his side. The house seemed to hold its breath as the wind keened through the halls. The doctor's whispered words, "His heart is weak, prepare yourself," hung in the air like smoke. Near midnight, his eyes opened once more. "Eleanor," he whispered, voice frayed with exhaustion. "Do you regret it?" Never, she said, her tears falling freely now. You have given me everything worth living for. He smiled faintly, eyes closing. Then you have given me everything worth dying for. Don't, she begged, clutching his hand. You promised not to leave. I promised to love you, he murmured. And love does not leave. His breathing slowed. For one terrible moment the world stopped. Then, as if called back by her sob, he drew another breath, ragged but living. The physician's voice broke through her despair. He's past the worst. If he rests, he may yet recover. She pressed her forehead to his hand, her body shaking with relief. Thank you, she whispered, not to the doctor, but to whatever mercy had heard her. Days later, sunlight spilled once more through the windows of Hawthorne Manor. The Duke, frail but recovering, sat in the garden wrapped in a woolen shawl. Eleanor stood behind him, her hands resting on his shoulders. He reached up, covering them with his own. You stayed, he said quietly. Always. He looked out over the roses just beginning to bloom. When I am gone, promise me you will not hide your heart away. She knelt beside him. Do not speak of endings. Our love began in punishment, let it end in peace. He smiled, weary but content. Then peace it shall be. From the terrace above, the bells of the nearby chapel rang faintly through the afternoon air. The sound carried across the valley, soft, steady, eternal. And though the world would remember the Duke and Duchess of Hawthorne as an odd match born of scandal, those who ever walked the gardens at dusk would say that love still lived there, quiet as the wind, constant as the light.